The new LG G5 is 1,000 nits brighter than last year's G4 flagship. In 1 year, they have increased brightness by 1,000 nits. What is happening right now? Has LG really truly leapfrogged the competition with their brand new tandem RGB OLED panel? Let's talk about it. All right, what's going on, everyone? True Techno Gamer back here. Thank you guys for watching. Please like, subscribe to the channel if you have not already. I still see the comments coming in. I still see the views on my video, so I really do appreciate it. So here we are. Back to TVs for a second, man. Now that the dust has settled, 2025, the TVs, have come out from all the major players here. And LG in particular, we're going to focus on because this is the first time in their roughly 13 years since they first introduced OLED TVs to the market, that they have actually have a new panel. They went back and redesigned a brand new panel that aims at increasing efficiency as well as performance, and it looks like they've done that. So we got to talk about that and just look at the jump from last year and put that in perspective based on the competition, and where the G5 may fit this year in terms of the ultimate king of TVs, right? So last year's G4, excellent TV. If you guys follow my channel, you know that I fairly recently got a 97-inch G4. Beautiful TV. I love that thing. No complaints there. I'll have another video soon with kind of me giving you guys updated impressions after several months of living with the thing. But beautiful TV. The new G5 is using a brand new panel, a brand new type of OLED panel. They call it a 4-stack RGB tandem OLED. It's tandem because it's 2 blue layers. It's 4-stack because it now uses 2 blue layers with separate green and red. So it's a true RGB, setup there. It's designed to be closer to QD-OLED in terms of the colors and in terms of brightness. But in fact, I think LG might have definitely surpassed any QD-OLED in existence so far when it comes to true brightness. But ultimately, let's just start by looking at what the jump looks like from the G4 to the G5 in terms of the numbers, okay? In terms of the numbers, because this is significant, guys. And I'm going to try to give you guys some perspective in terms of what we typically would see in 1 year, like the kind of growth we would see within the same TV series in 1 year. The jump that we're seeing here, guys, is just absolutely insane. And it's amazing to see that after 13 years of very, very small iterations, OLEDs didn't change much. Honestly, didn't change much at all for years, many years. And suddenly in 1 year, we just see this huge jump with this new panel. So I'm going to look at, we're looking at Rtings.com. I've talked about this website before in the channel. I love them because they're honestly the most comprehensive review site you will find for TVs. I mean, they have a very scientific, very measurement approach to everything. We're going to look at this site side by side. I'm going to look at last year and this year. So immediately you can already see the G5 scored higher. 0.3 doesn't sound like a lot, but for this website, that's actually a pretty significant increase, especially considering that the G4 was literally the second highest rated TV that they've ever had up to that point last year when the G4 first came out, right? So the G5 has eclipsed it clearly by a noticeable margin. And the main things that we want to look at here, of course, in terms of the specs, are looking at the brightness and then the color, right? We'll get to those things. So let's start by just looking at the brightness here, right? Now I'm going to start by looking at the G4, okay? And we're going to start the same area with the G5. So immediately, yes, G5 scores higher, right? 8.9 for both brightness. And the left column here, by the way, is the filmmaker mode. The right column is, as it says, in game mode. Now, one thing immediately to notice here is that there pretty much is no real noticeable difference in game mode. A lot of TVs drop brightness in game mode. They basically changed the processing to simplify things and remove a lot of the processing features in order to keep the input lag as low as possible for gaming. So, and a lot of TVs for some reason suffer where the brightness drops down significantly. And LG G5 does not have that problem. The G4 didn't really either. A little bit difference, but barely noticeable. Whereas the C4 had that problem a lot. And other TVs also had that problem. So now, just keep that in mind. Now, when we look at the numbers here, okay, let me just try to lay the land. I know you're probably already looking ahead, but the top 3 rows here, these are what Rtings call their real world scenes, which is important. This is actual content that's kind of more representative of what you would see in an actual movie or actual TV show, right? There's a lot of different colors, a lot of different objects on the screen at the same time. These peak numbers and sustained numbers are just basically test scenarios. Simple white boxes of different sizes. That's what the percentages are. 2% window, 10% window, 25% window, all the way up to 100%, which means full screen, right, window. White box, TV puts all of its power to that white box. So peak is, instantaneous burst. This is displayed for like a second or two, maybe. What is the absolute brightness you can get? Sustained is keeping it on the screen for a few seconds. Doesn't have to be minutes or hours, but just even a few seconds. A lot of TVs, you'll see that they'll drop over time because they're trying to manage the power load. They're trying to manage things like burn-in and stuff like that. So they will drop, right? So keep that in mind. That's also why when you look at the window sizes go from 2% to 100%, the brightness goes down significantly because 100%, this is just a pure white on 100% window. It's not a very realistic case, but it's a stress case. It will use a ton of power. And yeah, the TV is going to throttle down to protect itself and to, maintain a certain level of power efficiency there. So that's why you see that, just if you guys don't know, right? But in real world content, mostly what you care about are the small highlights that have to be really bright, the sunlight, the headlight from a car, or a lamp or something like that. Those are the things, and those don't take up the whole screen, if you know, right? So just keep that in mind. Now, that said, if you look at the real world content in general, the takeaway is that they're not very different. And that's not necessarily a bad thing or surprising, honestly. They are roughly 1100 nits for this big hallway scene that's mastered at almost 2000 nits. And then, it's able to match, both TVs are able to really pretty much match the other two scenes. Now, again, left is filmmaker mode. That's the most accurate mode out of the box for the TV. So you could throw it in vivid mode and probably get even higher brightness out of here in terms of just raw numbers. But this is, what is the TV realistically doing in a mode that is balanced and more attuned to what the artist intended, right? So more accurate mode here, right? Now, you can see the G4 the peak numbers are pretty much peaking out at about 1500 nits, a little bit more than 1500 nits. 10% is, close to 1500 as well, right? So 1500 nits for the peak, and everything kind of goes down from there. This 100% window is important. That's the full screen brightness. OLEDs, the one weakness area for OLEDs have historically been that full screen brightness, right? Low 200 nit, 200 to low 200s is pretty much where most OLEDs live and have lived for the last few years. So you see the G4, even with the MLA brightness boosting technology. MLA is the micro lens array. I've talked about that, which was like a film of microscopic lens in front of the OLED panel that's designed to focus the light towards the user so that your perception is you get more brightness. And it does work. MLA brightness is generally about 50% brighter. Non-MLA versions of this TV is closer to 1000 nits, for example, right? 1000 nits, maybe 1100 nits. So the G3 and G4 are topping out at 1500 nits. It's pretty good, right? I mean, that's from the MLA technology. Now we have this RGB tandem, guys. And look at this. When I said 1000 nits, I was not lying or not exaggerating. The 2% window went from 1500 to 2400 nits. That is insane. That is insane, guys. And 1400 for the 10% up to 2400 nits. This is flagship mini LED territory. I'm going to show you an example of that. OLEDs have typically been, again, the G4, guys, was literally one of the brightest OLEDs, if not the brightest OLED in existence just last year. So just in 2024, this was as bright as an OLED can get. Only 220 nits for 100%, peaking out at about 1500 nits, generally speaking. Now, look at what LG done did. 2400 nits peaking out. Sustained, guys. Doesn't drop a bit. Keep that in mind. 2400 nits is the peak instantaneous. Keep that thing on the screen. It's still able to maintain that 2400 nits in the accurate filmmaker mode, right? As you can see down here. Okay? This is insane. And then, also really important, look at that 100% window. 400 nits. For an OLED, guys, for an OLED, that is unprecedented, right? And it also is like, as you can see, literally almost double, pretty much, right? Like 80-something%, but almost double the full screen brightness of the G4 last year. That is also like crazy, okay? The jump here in these numbers are just amazing. Well, let's look at another example here to give you an example of what a typical increase may look like, all right? Now, let's look at the Sony A95L, king of TVs for the last 2 years. The A95L came out in 2023, guys. This is a 2-year-old TV, okay? But it was the best TV on the market in 2023, and it also was considered the best picture you can get from a TV in 2024, okay? Now, notice immediately the rating for the A95L with the new methodology is 8.7. The G5 was 8.9. 8.7, the G4 was 8.6. So like I said, when I said the G4 was the second highest rated TV that they ever had, that's why. This was the highest rated TV that they ever had. The G5 has already surpassed that. This is the new, brand new Bravia 8 Mark II, which is a QD-OLED that is, by Sony's own words, said to be the successor, the proper successor to the A95L. In practice, what you see in here is that there are some problems with this new TV. So Bravia Mark II, got some explaining to do, but that's a whole nother conversation. For now, I just want to show, again, what a typical increase might look like, okay? Now, they do these comparisons with all the other TVs, which I think is pretty cool. But let's get into the results, and let's just get into the brightness, which is kind of the top level now. And yeah, you can see that the overall brightness did increase a little bit, but this is kind of more typical what we would see year to year, right? It's not a whole lot of difference. If you look at the real world cases, honestly, follow my mouse here, they're pretty close. This is kind of more indicative of how well the processing is using the brightness to apply to these scenes, right? And the hallway lights, again, is mastered at a higher brightness nit level, is almost 2,000 nits. So they're generally pretty close, as you can see here. But then look at the numbers. So the A95 peaked out at 1,400 nits. The new TV is peaking out at 1,800 nits. So initially, you're like, wow, that's pretty good. The 10% window here, notice the drop here, though, right? Remember, the LG was pretty much the same, up to 10%. But it's 2%. That's why they do this. Some TVs can show 2% even brighter, and then 10% it starts to go down and it starts to go down. Usually 10% is kind of like the smallest window that a TV would target. At least some TVs, LG being one of them. So there is a drop here. There also is a drop here, but 1,500 nits at 10%, still pretty decent, right? But again, look at the 100% full screen. It's 221, and we see that went up a little bit. Went up like 10%, right? Roughly 10%. That's typical, guys. That's what I'm trying to say. Like, this is kind of what we typically would expect to see year to year, right? 10% increase here. If you look at this number here, it's kind of maybe more close to the 20%, right? 20-something%. That's pretty good. Like, these are pretty good. Now, look at the sustained numbers. It's generally still the same. You can see that the new TV kind of falters a little bit here, right? I mean, if you look side by side, it's not like that much higher, honestly. So, I mean, to your eye, you're probably not even going to notice a difference across the board here. And again, that's typical increase here, right? Let's look at the Samsung. Samsung is a little bit of a different story, okay? So again, it's the Samsung S95D on the left, okay? And this is the S95F, the brand new QD-OLED, all right? And again, real world scenes generally going to be, about the same. You see that there's some fluctuation here. The yellow skyscraper is noticeably higher on the old TV, right? This is the last year model. But generally speaking, they're pretty much the same, okay? Now, look at the peaks. Last year, peaking at 1,600. Now, peaking at 2,100. And it's down to 10%. So Samsung, kind of keeps that up to 10%, which is pretty cool. Pretty awesome, right? Again, 1,000 nits at 25, that's matching the G5. The G5, remember here, was 2400 though, over 2400. So this peak still is not quite matching that G5. G5 still wins out on the peak brightness. But the more interesting story here for Samsung is looking at the sustained window. So we had 1600 nits last year, and this is the problem with the S95D from last year. It was kind of broken, honestly. If you left in a 2% window, that 1600 nits, it still maintained it. But when you went to 10%, look at that number. Rtings have mentioned this, and they tested it multiple times. This was an issue with the Samsung and how it handled the processing. It dropped significantly. It looked actually pretty bad. Okay, it actually went back up with the 2500 number, but it dropped significantly when you try to sustain the brightness, right? So that's why this TV wasn't considered even as bright as the G4. Even though the peak numbers were technically a little bit higher, the sustained numbers, if you remember the G4, was still about 1400 nits. And Samsung wasn't able to match that, right? So that's a problem. Now, the overall 100% brightness, though, is close to 300 nits. That's already much higher than like the LG G4 from last year. But remember, the G5 was 400 nits, so it's still not quite there, okay? Now, let's look at what happened with the new TV. The sustained number here is 1400 nits. They obviously fixed that issue. Now, 1400 nits here sustained. Look at that now. The peak was 2100, okay? The sustained went way down to 1400 nits. All right, so now the sustained, now we're in the ballpark of last year's G4 and even, last year's S95D. The 10% window dropped even more down to 1,000 nits. They clearly fixed it from whatever was going on here. But again, the G4 sustains 1,400 nits at 10%. This S95F can't sustain the 2,100 nits. It can't even sustain the 1,400 nits. It's down to 1,000 nits. So they fixed that issue, but where it was dropping like to 100 nits, but it's clearly something going on with Samsung's processing here, okay, in their panel. The 25% is fine. The 50% is fine. As you see, it's pretty much in line with last year's G4. This is last year's G4. And then the full screen goes up to 400 nits, which, again, very much eclipsed last year's G4, okay? Again, looking at the S95D, the full screen brightness is above that as well. The other two are in the ballpark. But the sustained number is kind of the issue. And I want to point out again, if you look at these numbers, you might look at the 2100 and say, oh, that's still a lot. And it's over 2000 nits for an OLED, which is great. Don't get me wrong. And it's pretty close to the 2400 nits. It's pretty close. But again, 2400 nits is still higher. The G5 will win out. But look at those sustained numbers. What are you going to see when you're looking at a nature scene that's on the screen for several seconds at a time, 10 seconds at a time? You're going to see much lower brightness than you will see with that G5. Much lower. 2%, 1400, G5, 2% is still 2400. The LG processing is amazing. It's great because they're able to sustain the peaks, as you can see here, up to 10% at this pretty much the same exact level, right? And then even with the 25%, every number they have here is sustained over time. That's the key. And even 100% is sustained. It's pretty much still almost 400 nits. So when you look at the S95, right, it's way lower than that. Remember, the G5 was 1,000 nits still at 25%, right? So the G5 is going to be noticeably brighter. And again, if we compare that to the Bravia, this is the new Bravia Mark II, Bravia 8 Mark II, the new successor to the A95L, it's not even close. It's not even close, right? The 100% brightness is still much lower, right, at 239. 1,500 nits, sustained 2%. That's decent. Again, the G5 is literally at 2,400 nits here and 2,400 nits here, man. Right? 1,000 nits here. I mean, we're talking like over double at 10%, over double the brightness of the new Bravia 8 Mark II QD-OLED. Okay. So brightness wise, I mean, LG is knocking it out the park. And I showed you guys what it is even relative to the G4. But let's look at what it might look like with the king of LED, mini LED. That is the Bravia 9. Okay, so here's the Bravia 9, the king of mini LED, the highest rated mini LED that Rtings has on their site. And what does that look like? Okay, compared to the G5. Okay, Real world scenes, you see it here. This is the cream of the crop mini LED, right? The big advantage here you're going to see, look at that 100% off the bat. I'm going to just put that out there. The G5 has come up quite a bit, hitting 400 nits, which is still going to be pretty good. But 750, yeah, that's the mini LED. And then some of the TCL Hisense stuff is pushing 1,000 nits at 100%. That's insane. So that's kind of your advantage of mini LED. But in terms of the processing and ability to get those specular highlights, guys, look, it's right here. The real world scenes, am I lying? Am I making this up? I want you to look at these numbers. This is the Bravia 9 on the left. This is the G5 on the right. In real world content, the G5 handily wins. Handily wins, right? It's doing much more brightness on the hallway lights. It's doing more brightness with the yellow skyscraper, and it's doing slightly more brightness on the landscape pool. Across the board, it's brighter, especially in game mode. Notice that the mini LED dropped a good amount in game mode. And you can see the numbers here, right? It is a little bit lower across the board. G5 is definitely hitting that, right? But then look at the peaks. Again, this is the mini LED, so this TV was designed to be able to match the 4,000 nit reference monitor, right? 2% window, we're peaking at 2,600 nits. 10%, that actually went up. It's interesting. 2,800 nits. So the LGs, that's what I said. These are mini LED type numbers. Remember, this is the world's best mini LED. There's a lot of LEDs out there that don't come close to these numbers, by the way. This is the world's best mini LED. OLED has always been well behind in brightness, right? Not anymore. You see that the G5 is actually right up there, up to 10%. Now, above that, 25% and 50% clearly is still lower, but you probably wouldn't notice that in much real world content, to be honest. And of course, like I said, the peak 100% is also lower. Looking at the sustained, again, the Bravia 9 does a decent job of sustaining its numbers, as you can see here. But if you really look at it, 2,400 is sustained, 2,400 is sustained, 22 is lower than the peak. Is it not lower than the peak? It's lower. So when this thing is sustained, Sony's processing brings it down a little bit to help balance it out. And you can make an argument that, yeah, while you're sustaining content, the G5 gets brighter. Right? Now, again, 25% not quite there, but in general, the G5 gets brighter. Okay? So this is against the world's best mini LED. Okay? Now, the other thing I want to look at with you guys is the SDR brightness. All of this is HDR brightness, okay? Let's look at the SDR brightness because this is another area I want you guys to see. This is the G4 on the left, G5 on the right. The G4, 7.6 overall rating. The G5 went up to 8.8, guys. Huge increase, right? And this is why. You look at the real world scene, 500 nits for SDR. Now, SDR is usually mastered at 100 nits. Okay, so all right, so you don't need, it's not HDR. You don't need to have a full crazy 1,000 nit thing for SDR, right? So it's not something that you really need. But clearly G5 is still brighter. 800 nits now with that real world scene, guys. That's over 50% increase in brightness right there. Okay, but then look at the peaks. SDR for the G is still peaking at over 1,000 nits. Again, mini LED territory. We've never seen an OLED peak or sustain, as you see here, SDR numbers at 1,000 nits. Okay, SDR. This is Samsung's number. Look at their rating last year. Okay, 700 nits, 400 nits for the real world scene. We're peaking at 700 nits. We're not peaking at 1,000 nits, guys. That's not normal. Okay, all right. I just want you to be clear. This is peaking at 1,000 nits in SDR. Okay, and then to sustain the 100% window, we're putting almost 500 nits, guys. Almost 500 nits in SDR. Okay, versus 300 nits last year on the G4 I'm looking at right now, right? So this is also significant. A95L, king of TVs, SDR 7.3, 230 for the full screen, you know, a little over 200, you see that? We're pushing almost 500 nits now full screen. This is well over double the brightness of the A95L full screen in SDR, okay? Peak, as you see, it's about double, almost double. Almost double for the peak, 100% window. Again, 1,000 nits, 500 nits is what we're peaking out right here. That's double, right? That is double. So SDR G5 is a huge step up. All right, so the other thing we need to talk about is, of course, the color. So we're going to come down here, left G4. Right is the G5, and this is the other part of the story right now. For those that don't pay attention to TVs and, you know, really get into the nitty gritty, the LG OLEDs have been considered to be inferior because of their color reproduction. Historically, if you look at the G4 compared to a QD-OLED, so just for the sake of argument, we're going to get to this, but here's the Bravia 8 Mark II, and just look at the color, you know, breakdown here, right? 7.5 to 9.4 and 8.0 to 9.2. All right, you can look at the individual numbers here, but the basic story here is that QD-OLED, again, that's what it's about, right? That's what the quantum dots are for. It's giving you a broader range of colors, and then that's what the coverage number is here for the various standards. You see it has a lot, basically it can display a lot more colors, and the volume is how bright it can display those colors, right? So a lot more colors, a lot brighter than the traditional OLED, WOLED from LG. And this has been the case, right? WOLED, like I said, hasn't changed since it first came out, right? 13 years ago. So this has been the case, and then QD-OLED came out and said, hey, here's an OLED, but now it can do colors to this level, and kind of left LG behind in that regard. The main thing for LG, like brightness wasn't really it. The G4 was still already plenty bright. They obviously taken that a lot further, but the main thing that LG needed to address, if nothing else, was color, right? They obviously still have WOLED. The new the new tandem RGB is a 4-stack. It's still a WOLED. It still has a white subpixel in there, right? So the idea is you cannot get but so much color purity when you have that white subpixel. There's no way you can match QD-OLED, which is true RGB and doesn't have a white subpixel. That's the thinking. Well, can LG do that? Can LG get closer? Well, let's look again. So going from the G4 to the G5, we see that there's a huge bump in both the color volume, SDR, HDR, and the coverage. Is it matching QD-OLED? No, not quite, but it is very close. How close? Let's look at these numbers here. So just looking at the G4 to G5 again, you see the difference there. Okay, pretty big bump. I think the key thing here though is to look at the HDR color volume, which is again always been kind of a sore spot. 88% up to 96% now, so almost have full color volume for 1000 nit. That's what that means, 1000 nit for the DCI-P3. That's kind of like the most common color space right now. So for 1000 nit content within that color space, 96% coverage, coming up from 88%. Now, the BT 2020 is kind of more of the future. There's not a whole lot of content at that yet. That's the future, you know, color space is much broader for HDR. And, you know, it was only 39%. We're still only at 50% now, okay? But that's still a big bump, right? So this is for 10,000 nit, right? With the wider color space, like how far can we go? How far can we get? Every color sees a noticeable bump here, right? Now, the question is, how does that compare to a QD-OLED? Well, let's start by looking at the king of TVs again, right? It's kind of a good baseline for QD-OLED. So we see overall the color SDR still not quite there, right? We saw that there was a big bump, but not quite there. But look at this HDR color, 8.9 to 9.0. Pretty damn close, right? Like, how do we know how close? Well, look at that, 96.1 to 96.1. So for the DCI-P3, 1000 nit altered, guess what? LG is a match for the Sony A95L and QD-OLED, right? According to these numbers from our Rtings. Right now, at the larger and newer BT 2020 space of 10,000 nits, well, LG is at 53 and Sony's at 55. Again, 2 percentage points off, not very far off, right? So basically the story here is that LG, with this new tandem OLED panel, has essentially matched a QD-OLED, and not just a QD-OLED, but the QD-OLED, right, of the last couple of years, in terms of the HDR color volume. It's pretty much a match. Right, so I mean, again, the colors now with this new LG is gonna be much improved, noticeably improved, coming from the G4. G4 wasn't close to this, right? 96.55. Remember, the G4 was 88 and 39, right? Nowhere near. But now it's a match. That's pretty impressive, guys. So, I mean, again, this is a first generation. This is LG's first attempt at this panel. This is first generation tech. So it's only going to get better, only going to evolve. Okay. But as a first attempt, they matched the king of TVs with HDR color volume. Now, the SDR color volume, no, not quite, right? And we can see the numbers here. 99, still only 95. We got up to 70, but they're up to 86. So definitely more work to do there, but the HDR is right on. So there you have it, guys. LG making a comeback, right? Trying to leapfrog the competition, right? You see the numbers, right? So the numbers show a massive improvement year on year going from the G4 to the G5 and all of the key areas that were considered weaknesses, I guess, for LG OLEDs, right? Particularly the color volume, color gamut, color coverage, all got big boost. And the overall brightness got a huge boost to the point where the G5 is clearly far and away the brightest OLED on the market, the brightest OLED that has ever come to the market to date, and is really up there with even the absolute best mini LEDs. You saw the numbers against the Bravia 9. LG, props to you for doing such a good job year to year. That's a huge improvement. I still have yet to see a G5 at retail. I saw it at CES, but at retail, none of the stores, none of the Best Buys or whatever near me have them in stock yet, which is interesting. But I will see it soon for sure. I might chime in the channel what I think about it. But check it out. Let me know what you guys think, man. G5, S95F, Sony, sticking with the Sony Bravia 8 Mark II. In terms of OLED, that's the story, that's the scenario. Is LG ahead now? Are they set to win the shootout? Let me know what you think. Appreciate you watching this one. True Techno Gamer. For now, signing off.